Imagine for just a moment a government at the absolute peak of its power. Now imagine it turning its most fearsome weapon not on some foreign enemy, but on its own people, its own land. It sounds impossible, but today we are pulling back the curtain on the incredible, true story of the day America nuked itself.
I know what you're thinking. This has to be some kind of conspiracy theory, something ripped from a Hollywood script. But this isn't fiction. This really happened, right in the thick of the Cold War, fueled by paranoia and a desperate race for power.
You see, the victims of this nuclear attack, they weren't a foreign adversary. They weren't enemy soldiers on some distant battlefield.
And they weren't rebels or revolutionaries, not some threat to the nation. No, they were just ordinary people, going about their daily lives.
That's right. The United States government, in its obsessive quest for nuclear dominance, knowingly exposed its own unsuspecting citizens to deadly radioactive fallout. And the story of how they did it and how they covered it up is one of America's most deeply buried secrets.
At the very heart of this dark chapter is a little-known event called Operation Tumbleweed. And it's more than just a footnote in history. It's a chilling story of how fear and ambition can lead a nation to inflict a wound upon itself, a wound that would fester in secret for decades.
To really get how something like this could even happen, you've got to transport yourself back to the 1950s. The Cold War wasn't just cold, it was freezing. The US and the Soviet Union were locked in this terrifying nuclear arms race, and the entire world was holding its breath. America was desperate for an edge, any edge, and that edge came down to one thing: data.
These weren't just academic questions for scientists in a lab. These were urgent, life or death questions. They needed answers, and they decided that simulations just weren't going to cut it. No, they needed to run live field experiments. And it wasn't long before those experiments started to involve living, breathing human subjects.
Now, a perfect example of this happened back in 1953 out at the Nevada test site. It was an operation called Upshot Knothole. And this is where the line between what you could call a scientific experiment and just blatant human endangerment completely vanished.
Can you imagine? This was the chillingly simple order given to thousands of young American soldiers. They were placed in trenches, some just a couple of miles from ground zero of a live nuclear bomb, with no protective gear, no radiation suits, nothing. Just those 5 words.
The flash of light was brighter than 1,000 suns. The shockwave that followed was powerful enough to throw grown men to the ground. You see, these soldiers, they weren't just observers. They were walking, talking data points. And for decades, the government just flat out denied any connection, even as so many of these men went on to suffer from rare cancers and other horrific radiation-linked illnesses.
Which brings us to the main event, just 2 years later in 1955. This test was called Operation Tumbleweed. It was supposed to be a carefully controlled experiment, but instead, it turned into a haunting miscalculation, one with deadly consequences that would poison a huge swath of the American heartland.
On paper, the goal was simple enough, straightforward science. They were going to detonate a bomb, then track the radioactive particles to see how fallout actually spreads. This was seen as absolutely essential for planning for a potential nuclear war with the Soviets.
Here's the thing though, there was a fundamental flaw in their plan. You can calculate all the physics you want, but you cannot command the weather. And on that fateful day, the scientists got it wrong. They critically misjudged the wind patterns. It was a catastrophic error in judgment. And that one miscalculation was all it took. It unleashed what the locals would later call the tumbleweed death cloud, an invisible, silent poison cloud of radioactive material that drifted away from the desert test site and settled quietly over farms, over small towns, and over communities across several states.
So, as people started getting worried, as questions started being asked, this was the official line from the government. A simple, blanket denial. They told everyone that any fallout was completely harmless, that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. But doctors on the ground, well, they were starting to see a very, very different story.
This was the reality they were so desperately trying to cover up. Doctors in these small towns began reporting terrifying clusters of these health problems, sudden thyroid issues, spikes in cancers that were almost never seen before, even birth defects. And when they tried to raise the alarm, when they sent their findings to federal authorities, the reports would often come back with entire paragraphs blacked out, redacted. The truth was literally being erased.
And here's the most chilling part. Operation Tumbleweed, as absolutely shocking as it is,
It wasn't a one-off mistake. It wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a much larger, systemic pattern of secrecy and human experimentation that came to define America's entire nuclear testing program. You can trace this pattern all the way back to the very first atomic blast, the Trinity test in 1945, where the fallout that hit civilians in New Mexico was denied for decades. It continued with things like Project 4.1, where Marshall Islanders were intentionally left in a radiation zone just so they could be studied like lab rats. The common thread through it all? Secrecy and silence.
And just to give you a sense of the sheer scale we're talking about, take a look at Operation Plum Bob in 1957. In that one operation alone, over 18,000 American GIs were marched directly into nuclear blast zones. Not just once, but over and over again. The human cost of this race for data, it's just staggering.
For years, for decades, all of it, stayed locked away, buried deep in classified government files. It wasn't until the 1990s, long after the Cold War was just a memory, that these documents were finally declassified. And only then did the true scope of the fallout, both the literal and the political, start to finally see the light of day.
And when the real numbers finally came out, they were just devastating. The government's own studies eventually had to admit that over 14,000 cancer cases, many of them fatal, could be directly linked to the radioactive fallout from these tests on American soil.
The areas downwind from the test site became so infamous for these cancer clusters that the people who lived there, the victims, gave the land a grim nickname, the Death Strip. And while the government did eventually create some quiet compensation programs for some of the families, there has never, ever been a full public apology for what was done to them.
So, it leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it? Was all of this just a series of tragic accidents born from the ignorance of a new atomic age? Or was it the calculated, acceptable cost of ambition in a global power struggle? The chilling truth might be that in the desperate race to build weapons to destroy a foreign enemy, the most lasting damage was done right here in our own backyard.
If you found this story as powerful as I did, and you want to uncover more of this kind of hidden history, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next explainer.